Is it the case that an idea's wide acceptance makes it more probably true, or should we never trust the crowd? Let's consider. Hello, philosophers. I'm Chico. Welcome to the Philosopher Show, where we consider the greatest questions of human history. I remember one time I was talking to my cousin's friend, and she had this really out there theory about what the song Crash by Dave Matthews was about. And it was super popular at the time, so it tells you how old this was. And I remember saying, that can't be right. And I remember I realized that this song is not about the most pure of intentions, but her theory was pretty out there. And when I said that, she was like, yeah, I can't remember the kid's name, but she's like, hey, Billy, what is Crash about? And Billy looks over at us and tells us basically what she just said. And she goes, see? And I remember thinking, see what? What does that prove? Just because this guy agrees with you, does that mean that it's more probably true that that's what Crash is about? I mean, you could bring out a whole slew of friends, right? Just string them along together, and they could all say the exact same crazy theory, and that doesn't make it more likely to be true. Well, the fallacy that we're going to talk about today is called the argumentum ad populum, the popular appeal fallacy. It's a fallacy of reasoning when we think that just because more people believe something, it makes it more probably true, or possibly even certainly true. Now, as a brief caveat before we actually get into it, I should warn you that not all logic teachers all agree on the different labels that we give to these fallacies. Some people will use one label to refer to one thing, and another guy to something that's very similar but not quite the same thing. Some of them think that one fallacy is a subset of another fallacy, and there's very little consensus as far as I can see, which is not a big deal because all the logic teachers all agree pretty much that a certain assumptions in reasoning are fallacious. They just really don't agree on the labels. So just so you know what we're about to see, if you're watching this to get a better understanding for your logic class, you should definitely watch this video and get a good understanding of what the fallacy is here, but then check your notes to make sure that's how your teacher defined this word ad populum fallacy. He or she may have had some other idea in mind when they define it that way. And just to make sure that you're not totally confused, at the very end I'll compare what I'm calling the ad populum fallacy with the Consensus Gentium, with snob appeal, with bandwagon, with mob appeal, with a few of those very similar but not necessarily the exact same type of fallacies. But in any case, I think most of them would agree when I say the argumentum ad populum is the fallacy of reasoning that claims that because a lot of people believe something that it must be true, or it's more probably true, or something like that. A typical example that people give of an ad populum is theories about the world that are pre-scientific, pre-modern era. So it used to be the case that people believed the world was flat, and just because all these people believed it didn't make it true. I realize there are flat earth theorists now, but at the very least we could say, I don't think flat earth theorists believe that the world is like a square, that there are corners in the earth. And I believe that was something that people thought about. I know like the Aztecs, or it was either Aztecs or Mayans, believed that the world was on the back of a crocodile, and that, I think there's a tree on each corner holding it down on the back of the crocodile. Now, just because all of the entire empire of the Mayans, let's say, believed that the world was on the back of an alligator and that it was square doesn't mean that was actually true. Doesn't even make it that it's probable. The most ironic example I have of this argumentum ad populum fallacy came out of Philosophy magazine. I saw this magazine way back when I was still in the Air Force. I was a neophyte philosopher back then, and I was just picking up books that I found and reading whatever I could read. And I remember I was visiting my wife's family in Albuquerque. We were having lunch at the Flying Star, which is a restaurant out there. And they used to have these racks of magazines for almost any kind of interest that you could think of. And I saw, philosophy magazines. who would have thought there would be such a thing? So I remember getting this philosophy magazine, and the main article of the magazine was, who is the greatest philosopher? We did a poll of our readers, and here's what you guys voted on. And I remember thinking how weird that was. Even at the time, I wasn't really a philosopher back then, but even at the time I thought, why do I care what a bunch of guys like me think? Why would I want to hear their opinion on who the greatest philosopher is? I would want to know, who do the guys that are at the top of the philosophy game, the guys that are, just the brilliant guys of this era, who do they think are the greatest philosophers? That's what I would want to know. So interestingly enough, the guys that were voted at the very top, the top two guys I remember seeing there, are the guys that probably are the worst philosophers on the list. They're the guys that professional philosophers take the least seriously because they're just not good philosophers. But they appeal to a whole lot of people. So, of course, a whole lot of people rank them the highest. So yeah, just because a lot of people agreed on who was the best doesn't mean them the best. And it's ironic because you would think that a philosophy magazine would get that. What are we, like, rating boy bands here? Like, what kind of an article is that? Now you may wonder, why would somebody be tempted to make such a fallacy? Well, first of all, I should say that there are a couple of ways that you can make this fallacy. And one is when you're trusting in a claim about reality versus an argument. We'll look at the argument in a second here, but thinking about a claim about reality, why believe that it's the case? Well, you might see a bunch of people saying something is true and then think that it's true. And so, for example, on Instagram, for a longest time, I would see these, grandiose claims in Instagram stories. And there would be like, really nice pastel kind of like pictures with, a claim on it and maybe some blobby figures for the background. And I would see a bunch of people posting the same thing. And I would think, wow, okay, well, it must be that, this must be true. And especially because, here's why I would make the mistake, because all of these people, if they were going to share these stories, somebody would have fact checked here, right? Somebody would have looked around and said, is this really true? This seems like a bold claim. And so I assume that all these people had checked before they posted these or shared these stories. And then finally I started thinking, I really need to check these just to make sure. And sure enough, luckily there are, like Reuters has a fact check, and there are other news agencies that have fact checks, and Snopes.com. I think Snopes isn't the best, but they're dedicated to just doing fact checking. But think about my way of reasoning here. I'm looking around at all these people that are sharing stuff and thinking, well, somebody out here must have checked everybody else. Just imagine those people probably are thinking the exact same thing, right? Well, I'm going to share the story because obviously somebody checked to make sure this was right. And if we're all, assuming that, all it takes is one person to post a fake fact, and then everybody else say, well, of course they would have checked to make sure. Of course, those two guys would have, and you can imagine how the momentum would pick up, and that we would all end up believing crazy stuff. And it reminds me of, although this isn't the way it went down in the movie, but Home Alone, a huge family going to the airport, and you would look around and look at all the people and be like, we're in such a big family, somebody must have checked that Kevin was with us, right? But nobody checked that Kevin was with us, and now he is getting burgled. So one reason people could possibly make this fallacy is because you're assuming that everybody else would have fact-checked before they started sending these things out. And if everybody's assuming that, then we're way more prone to make this fallacy. Another possibility is when looking at arguments. When you think about an argument that you hear a lot of people making, it sounds like, well, even though I don't get why this argument works, it must be the case that all these people get why it works. So it must just be, some limitation on my. So for example, I remember teaching in philosophy class about the problem of evil. And I like to, when I teach, I typically like to have my students give me ideas, and then we go off of the ideas rather than just giving them lecture notes. So I like to ask in the problem of evil, what possible reasons can you think of that God might allow evil? And I remember a couple of students saying that because in order to have good, you must have evil. And when they said that, it struck me, that why would they think that? So I asked, well, you believe that God existed before all these things. He created all stuff besides himself. So, and you believe that God is all good, doesn't that mean that God existing before the creation of the world was just good without any evil? So can't we have good without evil? And when they heard that, they were like, oh yeah, I guess that makes sense. There's two students that said the exact same thing. And I asked, so why did you think that, what made you think that in order to have good, you had to have evil? And both students said, I don't know. I heard a bunch of people making that argument, so I figured it must be right. So think about that. They didn't get themselves why that argument made sense. They were just repeating something because they heard a lot of people say it, and they figured, well, it must be the case that all these people get it, right? They wouldn't be saying stuff that they didn't understand. So yeah, here's a second possible way that we can make this mistake. Another place that you see the ad populum committed a lot is in people's work or social groups, places where you have people that do a similar thing. There will be sort of like a popular belief and everybody will follow it. And not necessarily everybody will follow it, but a lot of people will just believe, well, most of us believe this, right? So I'm going to believe this thing too. So in the entertainment industry, for example, they all agree on certain political ideas. And if you don't agree with them, you're kind of not the norm. Chris Pratt got in really hot water recently. We have the election 2020 coming up in the United States, and Star-Lord didn't show up to a Biden rally, and everybody was all over his biscuits. And they just assume that like this guy is going to agree with them because, everybody agrees there, right? But the actual like jumping all over him is a different fallacy. So they're kind of like two fallacies committed there. Contrary-wise, in the military, I was in the military in the 2000s, and everybody's very conservative. There's not everybody that's conservative. There were a lot of people I wouldn't say a lot of people, but there were definitely people that disagreed politically with everybody else. But there were a whole lot of people that were just going with the stream. We all agree on this. Yeah, well, must be right. So I think it too. So yeah, in your in your place of work, you can tend sometimes to just believe what the crowd believes because it seems like, well, if everybody believes it, it must be true. Also in your social groups, places like in my church, a lot of people just, you could tell like there are some issues that they don't really know much or care much about because, I don't know, they're just not all that important to them, but they will just say, oh, is that what we all believe? Okay, good. I used to teach at an Episcopalian school, and it was, if you did not follow along with certain beliefs that they have, like for certain, and I'm not even talking about religious belief, I mean political belief. I was afraid I was going to get fired if I disagreed with certain people. And I know some guys that were told, do not disagree with us politically on X, Y, and Z. So yeah, it's very much the case that in your social group, and it's not just church. I know some people are going to be like, well, see, there goes religion again. No, it's any social group that you have. It seems like whenever we're doing the same kinds of things, right, we get into this sort of popular mindset. And I don't mean popular like, oh, that guy's cool. I mean popular as in like the majority of people in this group set believe this thing, so well, I'm just going to go with that. But notice in these cases, when you're making this ad populum fallacy, typically it's not something that you're thinking out loud. I'm just going to go ahead and believe what everybody else believes. It's typically something that you just either fall into or sort of subconsciously reason to. But there is also a way of making this explicit. So, for example, like I said, we're in election year 2020 in the United States here. And politicians oftentimes will appeal to the numbers, appeal to the majority of people's beliefs. So, 90% of Americans know that, I don't know, dairy farms should be subsidized, whatever the case is. And as if like those polling numbers made it true that dairy farming should be subsidized, that was the smart thing to do or the most prudent thing to do. So yeah, politicians will all the time quote, especially statistics, to show that there's a majority agreement. And in a democracy, of course, we make our decisions based on majority agreement. Well, not, I should say we elect people based on majority agreement and they represent us. But it's not because we think that, oh, the majority must be right. It's because we think, yeah, we should all have a say in this, and hopefully we're right, but we can be wrong. We can make mistakes. You'll also sometimes see an ad populum explicitly mentioned in advertisements. So, for example, McDonald's love to have that over 1 million hamburgers sold. And so this is, I would say, though, in advertisement, typically it's not an ad populum fallacy when they talk about everybody agreeing. Typically that's either a mob appeal or a snob appeal, where you're talking about popularity, as in like the cool people do this, or hey, you want to jump in with this crowd, you don't want to be left behind, or something like that. The ad populum is more, remember, belief that the more people believe it, the more likely it's true. So the more people believe that these hamburgers are good, the more likely it is to be true. And we see that also like in Amazon reviews, Google reviews. You know, if I see or some low number of people that rate this 4.7 stars, then I know that likely 7 of those are family or friends that you have, and probably this is not a trustworthy rating. If I see 20,000 people give you a 4.7 star rating, I think, well, then, you know, this is a lot more likely to be a good product. However, it's not always the case. You know, there's a reason why, and I'll talk about this towards the end when we start talking a little bit more about the ad populum and democracy. But there's a reason why we trust 20,000 reviews over 11 reviews. It's a little bit different than the ad populum type of reasoning. But even in these ratings, you still can see that they aren't necessarily trustworthy. So, you know, it might be the case that just everybody has been deceived. For example, Uba Butler, I think is his name, was a Vice journalist that got, he totally invented a restaurant. It was not real in any way. He was just sitting in his apartment, and this guy is like a journalist that's sort of like a master manipulator. And I don't mean that in a pejorative way, because it was kind of an all in good fun kind of a thing. He invents this restaurant, and through, you know, social media and through different, I don't know, tactics that he had, got his fictitious restaurant ranked number 1 on TripAdvisor for all of London. TripAdvisor is a pretty major website. And he got everybody to rate this thing high. I mean, and sometimes you see this on Amazon. I'll see guys like, they'll rate 5 stars for a book that hasn't come out yet. And I'm like, dude, you haven't read the book. How do you know that it's good? And they'll say stuff like, well, I know the last book was amazing. I can't wait for this one. So you haven't read it. Why would you rank this? So yeah, people can be deceived in these rankings as well. But it's still the case that, you know, more numbers would be more likely. And we'll talk about why that is in just a second here. Now, maybe you're still not convinced. Maybe you hear like the Amazon ratings and you think about that idea and you think, yeah, you know, I think that it is the case that when we have more people agreeing, that it makes it more likely to be true. And again, I'll talk about the reviews in a second here. But here are some possible reasons to convince you why the ad populum is a fallacious way of reasoning. And by the way, I should note here that to say something is fallacious way of reasoning is not to say that the conclusion is false. It's to say that we shouldn't believe it based on that reasoning. So it might be the case that people go bald because they take hot showers. That's what in Bolivia, that's what everybody used to believe. My mom's from Bolivia. And I remember my uncle was going bald, and that's what everybody said. Oh, he takes hot showers. That's why it's hitting your head. Yeah, maybe that's true, but it's not true because we all believe it. It's true because there's a good reason for it, if it's true, which it's not true. But if it were true, I hope it's not true, right? I'm not taking cold showers. In any case, here are my reasons. Number 1, we are all similar animals. We're all similar animals. The same kinds of things affect us. Same kinds of things will poison us. Same kinds of things are healthy for us. And then psychologically speaking as well, the same kinds of things affect us. You know, people saying mean things hurt our feelings. People saying nice things can make us feel good. And certain reasons are enticing for us. Certain ways of reasoning are easy for us to make mistakes on. And we all have the same kind of proclivities. So looking around at everybody and saying, see, everybody agrees here, is not something to trust in. Instead, what we got to do is evaluate our reasoning and say, are these good reasons to believe what we're all believing here? Another reason is because the well-documented phenomenon of groupthink, where people in a group, in order to be cooperative, will tend to agree with each other more than they will to disagree with each other. So if we tend to agree with each other, that's sort of like we're pressing each other in to believing things, not because we have better or worse reasons, but because, we want to be cooperative. There's also the phenomenon of gaslighting. This is something kind of recent, and it goes a lot with, Twitter especially, when people will just bomb you with these crazy claims, so much so that finally you sit there looking at yourself like, am I the crazy one if all these people believe it? I know there's something psychologically with being overrun by people saying something makes you think that something might be false that is true, or true that is false. And a final reason why this is not a trustworthy way to reason is, and I don't really know how to explain this, but the Mandela effect. Back in like the 2000s, everybody was convinced that Nelson Mandela was dead. I remember people talking about the Mandela effect. And I was like, what was the Mandela effect? What's everybody talking about? And they say, how like a lot of people think that Mandela is dead? And I'm like, yeah, because he is, right? Like Mandela's dead, right, everybody? Everybody agree? Yeah, Mandela's dead. And no, he's not dead. He's still alive. It was really weird. A lot of people, I don't know why. I never thought about Mandela, and yet I was convinced that I had heard somewhere that he had died, but he didn't. And I sort of look around to everybody else, like, everybody agree? And yeah, a lot of people thought the exact same thing, but he was still alive. Can you imagine how weird that would be? Everybody thinks you're dead, right? And especially if we're all committing ad populums, you can't be alive. Everybody agree this guy's dead? Yeah, sorry, man, you must be dead. So there are these cases where we have a majority of people believing something, and the majority of people are being deceived. And the majority of people are being reinforced in their deception because they're committing this ad populum fallacy. They're looking around like, yeah, everybody agree? Okay, I must be right. So yeah, this is a reason why we should not trust truth by majority vote. Now, there are some people that have pointed out that the ad populum isn't always fallacious, but I think what we'll see is that either when it's not fallacious, it ain't all that sexy, or when it's not fallacious, it's not really an ad populum. So for the first example, when I ask a question like, hey, what's the most popular band right now? And everybody gives their opinion. Well, popular band is determined by popularity, right? By how many people. So the more people agree, yeah, that's what makes a band more popular. So when the very content of the belief itself is about the majority opinion, then yeah, of course, an ad populum is not fallacious, because that's just what we're asking the question about. Another possibility is when, let's say, we talk about a majority agreement in authorities on a subject. So when I say the majority of scientists believe X, then it's more probably true. And that works, by the way, in philosophy as well. When the majority of philosophers agree with this, then a lot of times we think that that's a reason why at least it's more plausible, if not more probable, of a belief. But when we think about that, there's a reason why the numbers make it more credible than not. And that is because in the scientific community and in the philosophical community, sort of our job to analyze each other's beliefs, right? Somebody presents a concept or a hypothesis or an experiment that they did or something like that, and it's everybody's job to just gang up on that person. And I don't mean in like a mean way. I just mean like we analyze that thing to death to make sure that it totally holds water. And you almost want that as a philosopher or as a scientist, because at the end of the day, if your theory survives all that grilling, then it seems like, if such great minds are analyzing it to death and they can't find a fault with it, now that sounds more plausible. The difference here is that when we agree as just lay people. First of all, we don't have the expertise, of course. But second of all, it's typically with something that we all benefit for believing in. Or it's typically something that we at least don't benefit from analyzing all that much. Whereas when we're talking about the scientist and the philosopher, they benefit by analyzing that, by thinking very clearly about that theory. So, of course, it's the case that more people on the job are going to lead to more plausibility when it comes out the other side clean. So, yeah, it's not exactly an ad populum just because we're pointing to numbers. We're not worried necessarily. I mean, the numbers do have something to do with it. The more philosophers, the better. But it's not just that. It's also the fact that the more philosophers have subjected this theory to a thorough scouring. And that's why we think that it's more probable. By the way, that's not to say that scientists and philosophers aren't prone to making fallacies like the ad populum, even in their fields of study. So, for example, when it benefits a majority of philosophers or scientists to believe a certain thing, a lot of times, they will groupthink it. I think like steady state theory was a great example of something that didn't have a lot of scientific evidence, but, everybody sort of like, yeah, we all believe this. All scientists believe this. What? But it's not like they all were analyzing the heck out of steady state theory. They just, it benefited them to not have to explain some beginning of the universe. One interesting ad populum example that I'd like to go over now. Like I said, we're in the midst of election 2020. It's actually about a week away as I'm recording this, is something that I find in voting. And of course, if we're talking about a fallacy of believing the majority of people, democracy sure sounds like it would be prone to that fallacy. And by the way, don't think that I'm denigrating the US or democracy. I love the United States. I wouldn't want to live anywhere else. We were trying to move to Spain for a couple of years, but that didn't work because of the coronavirus. But anyway, one day, Spain, we're going to go out there and we'll be with you guys for a little bit. But there are lots of countries I love out there. Lots of countries, Vienna, in Austria. Whoa, Salzburg. What? Insane. Czech Republic, Prague, Tokyo. Oh, so cool. Love Tokyo. But I do love the United States. I'm not denigrating it, but there are certain, let's say, potential pitfalls of democracy that I'm bringing up because I'd like to caution us away from so that we can be a better country. So, for example, there is a big push to get everybody to vote. And that you'll see stuff like, please vote, like get out there and vote, rock the vote. The MTV had the most absurd taglines. P. Diddy once said, vote or die. And just bizarre things people will do. And it's like what they're saying is, doesn't matter how you vote, just vote. That's what it sounds like at first, right? And then you see some people that believe the following proposition. Candidate X would be best for this position. Candidate Y will actually cause major harm to the United States. And those people that believe that proposition will also be people that say, please vote, get out there and vote. Why don't you vote? Oh my goodness, please vote. It seems kind of weird to me. At first, when I hear that, I think, why don't you say, please vote for candidate X? And if you're going to vote for candidate Y, please don't vote. Why are they saying just please vote and leaving it open as to whom somebody might vote for? And I think the reason is, for some of these people that I know, by the way, so I think this is why they're saying that, is because they think that a majority of the people will necessarily get it right. That if 100% of the people voted, then the majority would vote for candidate X because, the majority are less likely to make a mistake and they would not vote for candidate Y. And when candidate X does not win, a lot of times what they see is, well, geez, it's because not enough people voted. If everybody would have voted, we would have gotten candidate X to win because obviously the majority would have picked X. The majority would have known that X was the best. But if you think about it, there's no reason to think that, right? If 100% of the people voted, that might be even more votes for candidate Y over candidate X. Why think the majority would go for candidate X? So it's almost like a reverse ad populum fallacy. People think that the majority of people must believe this thing that I think is true. Therefore, the majority will act this particular way. And I do think it is important for everybody to vote, by the way. I think that's absolutely important, even if they don't vote for my candidate. And it's not because I think that it doesn't matter who is president or anything like that. It's more because I think the more people that vote, the more get involved in the voting process, the more people are invested in our democracy, the less apathetic they are, the more prone they are to think about things. So I think, yeah, I want to avoid the apathy of not voting. I want to get more people on board. So I do think that's important. I also think that democracies are not built on the gamble that the majority of people are going to be right about who's the best candidate. I think they're built on the gamble that the majority of people are going to choose the candidate that they believe will be looking out for their best interest and not choose apathetically, right? Not just choose willy-nilly. So if you give me a choice, if I have a choice in whatever it is, I'm likely going to choose the thing that will not cause me harm and that will take care of me, right? Whereas if I don't get a say in something, if I don't have a choice, then the person that's choosing for me, if they don't know me, if they have no connection to me, likely won't care what they choose, right? Likely won't care about benefiting me or not harming me or something like that. So they're likely just going to choose whatever benefits them, even if it's the detriment of me. That, I think, is the benefit in democracy of everybody voting, is that we're all, we may be wrong about who is the best candidate here, but at least we're going to be choosing whom we think is going to be in our best interest. Whereas if we didn't pick, if we just let whoever get voted in, then for sure nobody's going to care. By the way, since we're on democracy, I should point out that the ad populum reasoning fallacy is not the same thing as tyranny of the majority, if you've heard of that. So tyranny of the majority is another potential pitfall in a pure democracy, which goes something like this. If we all did things just by majority vote, just by like 51% of the people, whatever they vote for, that's what happens, then there's a potential here for the majority of the people to vote for something that would benefit them, but would significantly harm the minority of the people, right? So that's called the tyranny of the majority, that they could sort of overrun the minority. In the United States, we have a representative democracy and not a pure democracy to avoid things like that. We vote, sure, as a majority on who is going to represent us, but hopefully the representative has, the upstanding character to not allow minorities to get overrun like that. But the ad populum fallacy is not the same, in that it's a fallacy of reasoning in thinking that the majority of people must be right. Whereas the tyranny of the majority, it's not that they're saying, we believe this because the majority of people believe this. It's that they're saying we're doing this because the majority of people want this to be done, whether it's the right thing to do or not. So yeah, tyranny of the majority is more like a failing of character. Ad populum is more like a failing of reasoning. Before I go on and compare the ad populum to the other fallacies that I talked about at the very beginning of this video, I should say that it's also possible to make almost a reactionary fallacy. And I don't even know if this is legit, but because I'm Latino, but I don't speak Latin, is you call it argumentum contra populum, which, if the majority of the people believe something, then it must not be true, or it must be less likely to be true. And this is something you kind of see in, people who like music that is stuff you've never heard of before, and they don't like the mainstream stuff. They think, mainstream sucks. It's just indie or die. And sadly enough, I tend to be this guy. When I hear a popular band that everybody likes, like 21 Pilots, my son loves 21 Pilots, and I gotta admit, yes, that is pretty good music. Whenever I hear it on, I'm like, I kind of like this. Yes, let it play. But I begrudgingly do, because I think, if the majority of people like it, they must be wrong, because the majority, of course, wouldn't know. They make all kinds of mistakes like this. So yeah, I'm kind of this guy. This is also like a bit of snob appeal, and we'll talk about that in upcoming videos as well. But this is also committed by conspiracy theorists, right? They think, well, of course, all of you people out there, you think that this is true because you all have the wool pulled over your eyes. So they're more prone to believe something is false because the majority of people believe it. Or back in the 60s and 70s, they talked about conformos, right? You guys are just a bunch of conformos. That's why you're doing what you're doing, as if like what they were doing was the right thing to do or the wise thing to do or the prudent thing to do because it was counter the culture. Who cares if it's counter the culture? The question is it wise? Is it prudent? Is it a good thing to do? Final thing we'll talk about, I think this is going to be a long video and I apologize, but there's so many good things to talk about. The ad populum versus some of the other fallacies. First, let's talk about the ad populum versus the Consensus Gentium. Consensus Gentium is sort of like appeal to a commonly accepted principle versus pointing at how many people believe it, right? And so that's really confusing because they sure sound very similar. But I think the difference would be something like this. Imagine that everybody in the world except for you and me die. And we're the last two people left on the earth. And we're having a conversation. And you say something that you were regretting all the things that you did in life, and you say, oh my gosh, I can't believe I did that. And I say, hey man, everybody knows that everybody makes mistakes. So now notice what I'm doing there. I'm appealing to a truth that is accepted commonly amongst people. And the fact that there's only one other person in the world right now, so that's pretty low numbers, doesn't really affect the Consensus Gentium, right? It's a principle that we all hold, and it's something that we think that should hold even if there's two people left in the world. Whereas if instead we're talking about, did Nelson Mandela die in 2005? I think he died in like the 2010s-ish, 2010s, something like that. If we're sitting there talking about that, and I say, you believe that he died in 2005, I believe he died in 2005. Dude, everybody in the world believes that he died in 2005. Of course he did. What? Right? Then it sounds ridiculous. 100% of the people, but there's only two people, right? Everybody out here, both of us believe in it. That is clearly an appeal to numbers. That's an appeal to the more people believe it, the more likely it is to be true. That's kind of, the gist of the difference. I will eventually explain a Consensus Gentium. I think the Consensus Gentium can be valid more often than ad populum can be, but it also can be fallacious as well, easily. The next fallacy is the bandwagon fallacy. And a lot of times the ad populum is considered just synonymous with the bandwagon. I don't think so, and here's why. I think the bandwagon fallacy is more about going with the momentum. It's not necessarily how many people believe it right now. It's the fact that everybody is starting to believe it, or lots of people are starting to jump on the bandwagon. We're all starting to go that way. So I think it's a lot more about the momentum. So for example, in election 2020, maybe we'll see this happen. There's a really bizarre phenomenon in U.S. elections. I don't know if in other elections, but when it looks like a candidate is going to win for sure, then people will just start pouring in the votes for that candidate that they think is going to win, right? And this is also why it's so important for the politicians to have their polling numbers, right? Whoever's ahead in the polling, other people start saying, yeah, I think that guy is going to win. And then more people say that. And so it's this huge fallacy. But again, it's a fallacy more in the way that the momentum is moving. You'd think it'd be the opposite way, by the way, as far as the voting, right? When it looks like your candidate is going to lose, you'd think you'd go out and vote for your candidate. Whereas it seems like when it looks like they're going to lose, everybody just hands up. And then why would you go and vote for a guy that you think is going to win regardless of whether you vote or not? It's really weird, but I don't know. That's the phenomenon. So I think that's what bandwagon is. Although, wrong side of history arguments are bandwagon fallacies. Like, why do we care if you're on the wrong side or the right side of history? The question is it true or not whether a bunch of people are starting to believe it or not. So that is a bandwagon fallacy if we're talking about the momentum, not necessarily the number of people. Another fallacy that's sometimes identified as a subset of the ad populum is snob appeal. I don't know. I may be wrong on this one, but to me it looks clearly not an ad populum, because snob appeal, it has all to do with exclusivity, right? It has to do with, not single numbers, but like small numbers, like you don't want something if everybody can have it, which I think is the opposite of what I'll call mob appeal. Mob appeal is something that sometimes people will say that an ad populum is just synonymous with mob appeal. I don't think so. And the reason being because for mob appeal, I think this is more like a popularity thing. Kind of weird because I said that ad populum is popular appeal. What I meant by that is appeal to the people, appeal to the most people possible. Whereas popularity as in the cool kids, that's a little different. Popular can mean not, just people, but popular as in like, this is the popular thing right now or something like that. Yeah, you do want a larger number, but there's a point where there's too many. If every single kid believed it, then it wouldn't be cool anymore. So we would ban, especially like if parents believed it, if everybody thought like Pokemon was cool. I saw this in a South Park episode. Everybody thought that Pokemon was cool, and then the parents started to like the Pokemon, and that's when the kids stopped liking it. So that was a mob appeal, like everybody was jumping in on this thing, but it's not because of the numbers. It's more because wanting to be in with that cool crowd. I think that's different from the exclusivity thing as well, although it's hard to see, I guess, right now. And that's not really what the topic is. We're really talking about the ad populum and how it's different from all these different things. But in any case, there is the argumentum ad populum, believing that a thing is more likely true because more people believe it, or because more people claim it, or something like that. If you have any questions on this, please feel free to hit me up in the comments. I'd love to answer any questions. And if there's another material fallacy that you have that you want me to go over, please let me know, and I'd love to do a video on it. That's all I got for today. I'll see you next video. Adios.